Hello, Lemonsterites. This is your state representative, Natalie Higgins, here for the October episode of Representing Leominster. And you know, in an election year in October, we usually dedicate this to ballot questions. A really important part of our elections are ballot questions. And I'm excited in this episode to have representatives from question 1 and question 4 to talk about these ballot issues and really explain what's behind the ballot question and why you should support it. And so I'm really thrilled to be joined with a good friend, Steve Crawford, who is from question 1, the Fair Share Amendment. And Steve, thank you so much for taking the time to join me. I'm hoping you can kind of at first break down what is the Fair Share Amendment? Why have we all been working on this for years now?
Well, thanks for having me. The Fair Share Amendment is an amendment to the Constitution that would attempt to fix our unfair tax system. Under the current tax that we have, the wealthy in this state pay a smaller share of their income in taxes than the rest of us. What the Fair Share Amendment would do is it's really quite simple. It's a four-sentence ballot question. I will summarize it this way. If you make $1 million a year or less, you will not be impacted by this at all. You won't pay a penny more. If you are lucky enough to make over $1 million a year, you're going to pay a little extra on your second million, and if you're lucky enough, your third and fourth and fifth. That's it, basically, except for the fact for the first time in the history of the Commonwealth, the money raised by the amendment is constitutionally protected to go to transportation and education. They can't spend it on anything else.
Yeah. So Steve, this isn't a regular ballot question. This is a constitutional amendment that the legislature can't tamper with. Only all of the voters could ever make an amendment.
That's correct. That's correct. And I'll give you an example. The current tax rules that we have, they were established over 100 years by amending the Constitution. Everybody pays a flat 5%, which is a great advantage for the rich because the 5% of your income, if you make $20,000 a year, is going to have a much greater impact on your lifestyle, than if you make $20 million. But we're trying to correct. Here we are, 115 years later. We're trying to correct that amendment so that just 4% more for anything you make above $1 million.
And something that I think has been helpful for all of us to remember. Making $1 million is $20,000 a week, right? Like to think about kind of what kind of income that is.
Yeah, I mean, Natalie, as you know, I have my own small business. I've been lucky enough to run that for 21 years. You'll hear in some of the conversation about it. It's an S corporation. All that means is that my business taxes are taxed at the same rate as personal income. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But after 21 years, I will tell you, $1 million of profit is a lot of money. This tax question will not touch revenue. It's only about profit. That is a lot of money.
So I was hoping that we could do a little myth busting because we've definitely seen some attacks. So you covered the small business piece. My parents are small business owners as well. This is not a business tax. This is an income tax. So it would only impact small business owners who are taking home in pay more than $1 million a year.
Correct. And I know another question is people are confused. They think I make more than $1 million a year. I have never been lucky enough to do that. As much as I wish I could say yes, and I'm happy to pay a little bit more, that is not one of the myths that we need to worry about.
What about retirees? I've heard that this could have an impact on retirees.
I'm 68 years old. I don't know. I don't really know how to answer that other than it's not true.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah,
It doesn't tax your Social
yeah,
Security. It
yeah,
doesn't, it doesn't tax your 401k.
yeah,
It really, any income that you make either full-time or part-time,
yeah.
if it's under $1 million, it doesn't tax that.
We do a
Um,
couple of senior coffee hours every month, and hearing that, uh, for them, it's been really laughable. They're like, I don't know any retiree who's bringing home $1 million a year in their retirement.
yeah, and I don't know anybody who's running a real small business
Mm,
that, what you would think of as a small
yeah.
business who's taking home more than $1 million a year.
What about, we've heard, and I really, this is not something that we see in Leominster, but home sales. There's some messaging out that, like, maybe if you sold your home, you would be subject to this.
I mean, you would need to live in Wellesley or Dover or Martha's Vineyard, literally, to have any chance of that impacting you, because those are the only communities that the average home price is above $1 million.
And I always want to remind folks that, right, that's the income after the sale, and there are plenty of ways that you can deduct your expenses, what you've invested into that property over the time, and we give the first 500,000 kind of is tax.
It's a write-off. So if you bought the house for 300, if you sell your house for $1 million, right? But you bought it for 300, that doesn't count. So you take 300 off of that, you're down to 700. You put on in you raise the dormers, you put in a new kitchen, you refurbish the bathroom. That's another 100. So where are we now? We're down to 5, plus the write-off that you just mentioned. A married couple can write off $500,000 right off the top. So that $1 million home, that home that you sold for $1 million, your income, that your taxable income, is essentially nothing. And it's just a scare tactic that the lobbyists for the billionaires are trying to use to scare people. So,
yeah. So we have a few more minutes, and so our viewers live in Leominster, and it's a gateway city. Can you talk a little bit about where the money is going to go and what the impact will be on communities like Leominster, our sister city, Fitchburg? Because I've been working on this even before I was elected state representative, when I was the executive director of Phenom, because it will create some tremendous opportunities in education and transportation.
And transportation. I mean, Leominster really suffers from, inadequate transportation, both in terms of, automobiles and trucks, and but also mass transit. The commuter rail is, inconvenient at best. And the money from the amendment is, as I said earlier, it is required to be spent on transportation and education. Now that covers a whole myriad of things, but Leominster has a whole myriad of problems. I think of the access off of Route 2 in North Leominster as something that's particularly troublesome. That it's an area that's in desperate need of a restructuring of that roadway. The reason it's taken so long is we don't have the money. Yeah. We'll have $2 billion a year dedicated to projects like that one, dedicated to building new schools across the state, including Leominster, adding new capabilities to the school. During COVID, where a lot of kids really suffered, it wasn't just that kids were having trouble with connectivity of their classes at home. Connectivity within the schools themselves was a disaster all across the state. Everybody had different systems, and in the modern era, those kind of issues really need to be resolved if we're going to be able to remain competitive, and if Leominster and Fitchburg and other communities in that area are going to be able to grow economically.
One of the things that I talk about in supporting this and being a representative from Leominster it really is about bringing Boston wealth and creating opportunities for investments in communities in Central and Western Mass, making sure we're leveling the playing field. The folks who are going to be subject to this tax don't live in Leominster, right? And we're making sure that they're paying their fair share. You and I pay more in taxes than folks who make more than $1 million a year in proportion to our income. And so we desperately need these investments in our education and transportation that we all benefit from.
We have about 3.5 million people who pay taxes in Massachusetts. 21,000 of them will be impacted by that. That works out to be 0.07%. It's a very, very small number. And as you said, the people who are very wealthy, the very few of whom live in Leominster or Fitchburg.
We did the math in Leominster. It's 0.0003% of our population. That
sounds like one guy with a couple kids, right?
Yeah, it's about a dozen people.
Really?
Yeah. It really is these investments that we desperately need. Talking to Leominster residents, they're really concerned about the state of our roads and how are we going to come up with a plan to fix them, about investments in education. The Student Opportunity Act is doing some really amazing things for Leominster, but what about early ed? What about higher education affordability?
Yeah, we really still haven't come out of the pandemic, recovered from the pandemic. We could have another wave this fall, this winter. I'm not going to get into that, but our kids in particular are struggling, and middle-class families just trying to stay safe and put food on the table, and try to hang on to a job and figure out how to do it remotely, or if they couldn't do it remotely, how to make sure that they didn't bring something dangerous and deadly home that was going to get the rest of the family sick. It was really hard for a lot of people for a long, long time. The wealthiest people in this state got richer. We have 41% more millionaires than we did before the pandemic. Think about that. People who just got rich because the stock market went up, when the rest of us are just trying to hang on, and it doesn't have to be doesn't have to be that way. And it's because we have an imbalanced tax structure. We have a chance to change that. The people have a chance to go and vote, and it's very rare in this country that people can do that on the state level. And I hope people will vote to support it. And your support's been really important along the way too.
Well, Steve, thank you for taking the time to join us, talk a little bit more about the Fair Share Amendment. It's been really great. And we're going to take a little break and come back and talk about question 4. So thank you, and we'll see you in a little bit.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome back, Leominsterites. We are still here for our October episode. We did a little room change, but I'm really glad to be here with the Yes on 4 campaign to talk about why this question is so important for Leominster and for the rest of the Commonwealth. So Frank, thank you so much for joining us to talk about what Yes on 4 means and kind of how did we get here to this being on the ballot?
Thank you, Representative. I'm really happy to be here. Well, Yes on 4 is on the face of it, actually a very simple proposition, though the question itself might appear confusing. In June of this year, the legislature passed with overwhelming numbers a bill that is called the Work and Family Mobility Act, and that removes immigration status as a barrier to getting a standard driver's license, meaning everybody now in Massachusetts who's qualified will have the opportunity and can show their identity and can show their residency just like you normally would when you're getting a license, and now has the opportunity to take the test, buy insurance, and get fully licensed to be a driver. And that is following the example that was set by some 16 other states that have implemented that law already. And unfortunately, there was a ballot initiative started to challenge it very soon after the passage, which we were hoping wouldn't make it onto the ballot, but it has. So it means that voters will have a choice whether to support this law, support it with a yes vote, or reject the law with a no vote, and therefore the law would be repealed, and we would continue with the current system. One of the reasons it had such overwhelming support in the State House is because so many different sectors of the economy and so many different experts on traffic and safety believe that this bill would act as it has in so many other states in improving road safety, to make sure that if you happen to be in an accident, the other person, there's much more likelihood they'd have insurance, they'd have a license. And that's why we have so many law enforcement also coming out and speaking in support of the bill, or rather the law.
Yeah, the law, which hasn't gone into effect yet, it's set to go into effect next year. And in the House, my yes vote was with 129 other colleagues, which is an overwhelming vote for the legislature. And can you talk a little bit about the other states that have had this law in place? I know that there are some red states. I know that some of our neighboring states have had this law on the books for quite some time.
Yes, for example, Connecticut has had this law since about 2015, so a good 7 years. New York recently passed the law, and there is a study coming out that I've heard about that shows how much uninsured driving has dropped in New York State already. And Rhode Island passed it after we passed it, and they have yet to implement it. And Vermont also has had this law for several years. So those are just our neighbors, but it like we were saying, it includes 16 other states. That includes some red states like New York and New Jersey and Maryland, but also purple or bluish states like Virginia and Utah and New Mexico, which for a long time is sort of purplish, would go back and forth. And a lot of those states that have had this law for a while have done studies, and they've shown from Connecticut all the way to California that there's been drops in the number of uninsured drivers, and that some states have seen actually huge numbers of fewer hit and run accidents, like Utah and New Mexico.
Yeah, so there's data to show this, and really a yes on 4 vote is about making sure all Massachusetts drivers can be licensed and registered and insured.
That's right.
Pretty simple.
Yeah, because all those things, of course, as you know, as all drivers know, they're all interconnected in the system. And so once a person can learn the rules of the road, take the road test, take the eye test, pay all the fees, get their license, then they can insure their car, get it registered, go through the whole process, and then be a much safer driver, and also add to mobility. This will increase the mobility of immigrants without status who need to get to the doctor, say, or need to take their children to school, or get mountains of groceries, say, for families, or get to distant jobs, just like we all do. A car inside the city of Boston itself might not be a necessity, but as we all know, in most places in Massachusetts, just to live, you need to be able to drive as well, or somebody in your family needs to be able to.
Yeah, and that's definitely the experience in North Central Mass, in Western Mass. While we do have some public transit, it's not super reliable. It's often doesn't get you where you need to go.
That's right. And we have heard from doctors how they supported this bill because it would help get people to clinics so they could get vaccinated. There's just all sorts of reasons that people would need a license so that they can get around.
Yeah, and it was supported by our law enforcement as well. I know that the coalition worked very closely with the Mass major city chiefs of police to make sure that the legislation made sense.
Yes, we were very proud just before it passed in the State House, and thank you for your vote so much. It was endorsed unanimously by the Massachusetts Major City Chiefs of Police, and that organization has a chief, represents the chiefs of every city with a population of more than 40,000 people. So that's a really good sign of how much chiefs of police think that this law will help make the roads safer, help make their jobs easier, that people will have license to proper forms of identification if they have to be pulled over for a broken taillight or whatever. So it's a really useful and common sense legislation that we've seen in some of our largest states has really been wonderful. And we think it should go forward and continue the implementation process. And like you said, it's not going to be implemented until July of next year, and that period was built in so that we could work with the Registry of Motor Vehicles to promulgate any legislation, to do any training, to do whatever was necessary to make sure that this would be so secure. One reason we also saw that law enforcement so resoundingly supported this bill, and besides the chiefs, there was also a majority of the district attorneys, a majority of the state sheriffs. As I was saying, one reason that they did is because they also helped to write it. They helped to make sure that it would be a very safe and secure piece of legislation. So on the back end, that there's proper identification for everybody who goes in to apply for a license. And then that once they complete that, that there's absolutely no chance of any sort of accidental voting or any sort of fraud occurring. We've seen time and again that the Secretary of State has spoken about how this is a secure system, because we already have so many people getting licenses, thousands of people every year who get licenses who are not citizens and already have the right to do that. People with what they call green cards, for example, they can get licenses, or 16 or 17-year-olds, and they're not registered to vote.
Those protections have been in place. They're already there, and this is just going to fit into the system that we've already been using.
That's right.
Yeah. No, I think that is great. And one of the reasons why I was so proud to support Yes on 4 and really wanted to kind of bust some of the myths around it was, at the state level, we can't resolve issues with the immigration system, but we can do is make sure that our roads are safer and that our neighbors who are our neighbors are able to get around as safely as possible.
That's right. As you know, as everybody knows, immigration is a complex and intractable problem that it does need to be addressed, that the immigration system doesn't seem to function like it should. But most people who are here because they were often fleeing violence or some sort of horrible situation back home, and there was no way for them necessarily to get the papers. Even they might be working on it for years, decades even. But the system has changed so much, and it's such a mess that it's very, very hard, often actually impossible for them to get those papers. But and in the meantime, 2/3 of the people who do not have authorized immigration status have already been living in the United States for over a decade. Most of their children are U.S. citizens because they were born in this country. They're going to U.S. schools. And those are the children who need to get to the schools. Those are the families that need to be able to get to their jobs.
Yeah, no, Frank, I really appreciate you being available to come on, just talk about question 4 and what it does and what it doesn't do, and why I'm voting yes on 4 with you. And
I would mention that it took a long time to pass this bill, but in a way it passed at a very good time because there's these two systems of licensing. There's the standard license that many people already have, and then there's the Real ID, which is a federally sanctioned license that this immigrants without status wouldn't have access to. It would just be the standard license that they would get, so they wouldn't be able to enter federal buildings or use it to fly on a plane or do any of the other things that the Real ID you'll be able to do with. And of course, that Real ID is not essential. You don't have to get it, but it might make people's lives easier if they consider it as it gets implemented next year.
Frank, thank you so much for taking the time to join me and for breaking down question 4. To everyone who tuned in this month, thank you so much. You have 4 ballot questions. We highlighted 1 and 4, but do your research and you've got a little more time to get your vote in before November 8th. So make your voice heard on these ballot questions. Frank, thank you so much.
Thank you, Representative.